Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar on the European Market Monitor on Energy Storage. There's still many people signing in, but we're going to kickstart and look at the latest trends and status in Europe based on our recent report. So in today's webinar, we're going to just start with some brief introductions. We're then going to look at some key findings from a report we recently published in association with the European Association for Storage of Energy. We're then looking at the Clean Energy Package implementation, and our hot topic this year was local flexibility markets. But before we start, I want to just introduce all of our speakers today and introduce the companies that we have online. So I'm Philippa Hardy. I'm a principal analyst at Delta EE, and I lead the research area of demand-side flexibility and energy storage. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Patrick. And Patrick, if you can give you an introduction.
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Patrick Clarence, and I'm Secretary General of EMMES, the European Association for Storage of Energy. As the name says, we are looking at the storage topic exclusively.
Thank you, Patrick. And I'm also joined by my colleague, Robin. And Robin, if you could give your introduction, please.
Thanks, Pip. Hi, everybody. My name is Robin Adey Johnson. I'm an analyst on Delta EE's Energy Storage Research Service, and I conducted much of the research for this report. So I'm looking forward to talking about it and answering your questions.
Thanks, Robin. And to give an introduction to our two organisations, I'll ask Patrick first to talk a little bit about EMMES and what you do in your organisation for those that may not have heard of you before.
Yes, I hope everybody heard about EMMES before, but one never knows. Yes, as you said. So EMMES is a European association. We are composed of research centres, industries, equipment suppliers, component suppliers, but also distribution system operators, transmission system operators, and consultants. So it's the whole chain which is looking at energy storage, which is represented in EMMES. We mainly push for business cases, meaning we're pushing for the development of storage on the markets, creating products on the TSO level, but also getting the regulatory framework right, pushing for avoiding double taxation, double fees for storage, and all the other parts which are hampering the development of storage. We were created in 2011, so next year we'll be having a big 10 years party. I hope you're all coming. And we will continue to push for this rollout of storage, also of different technologies. So we're agnostic regarding technology, and it's really the business case and the revenue streams which are driving the work of EMMES.
Perfect. Thank you, Patrick. And we look forward to your 10-year anniversary next year and the big party. And next, a small introduction to Delta Energy and Environment, again, in case any of you haven't heard of us, but I assume most of you online will have. But Delta Energy and Environment, or Delta EE, we're a unique research consultancy in that we really specialise in new energy research. Our core expertise is on the 6 knowledge areas you can see here. So EVs and electricity, flexibility and energy storage. Now this is the research service that we'll be pulling out the findings from today and the reporting from. Heat, distributed power, digital energy and new energy business models. We deliver our research through 2 ways. We have 11 annual subscription research services, which are very detailed and provide lots of deep expertise into these topic areas. But we also deliver bespoke consultancy services to a wide variety of clients in a very wide variety of roles across the energy and non-energy sector in these specific new energy topics. And today's webinar, we're going to be talking about a report that we published in association with the European Association for Storage of Energy. We published this last week. Now, we're sharing some highlights today, and this is the 4th edition of this market monitor. So we're in our 4th year of doing this report, and it really is becoming an industry must-have. It's providing that standard kind of baseline of information and the industry that needs to see the energy storage markets and how they are developing. It's based upon primary research with leading companies and stakeholders, many of whom are members of EMMES, as well as Delta EE. And what we're trying to achieve here is providing a common set of data, market and policy information that industry stakeholders can really rely on. We have more details and we have a marketing pack for anyone that's interested. The report is available to purchase. All members of EMMES and subscribers to Delta EE Energy Storage Research Service already do have access to this report. If you need help locating it, please get in touch. And we will be hosting a webinar just for subscribers and organisations that buy the report and EMMES members in the week commencing the 27th of April, taking a look through the whole report in lots more detail than this webinar and covering all countries. So as I say, please get in touch with the email addresses at the bottom there if you'd like more information. But let's move on to some key findings, and Robin's going to walk you through what we found this year.
Great, thanks Pip. So I'll start by just highlighting firstly that the market monitor really focuses on electrical storage at the moment, which is via kind of electrochemical and mechanical assets, storage assets, because that's where the market activity is. We do recognise that pumped hydro storage represents a large, by far and away the most actually installed power capacity in Europe. So that's 2,400 gigawatt hours versus 1.1 gigawatt hours for other storage technologies. But actually the market activity here is relatively limited. So we focus in this report on those other technologies. So the chart that you can see on the screen at the moment is our view of the annual European energy storage market, the energy installed each year, broken down by the front of meter, commercial, industrial and residential segments. And you can see that there's been nice healthy growth over from 2015 through to 2018. The 2018 was actually a standout year. There was enormous growth in the front of meter segment, which was driven in part, or no small part, by the UK's enhanced frequency response tender. And this drove a lot of projects, 200 megawatts of projects. There was kind of continued growth in the residential segment, and there was a lot of positive activity in the CNI segment. Pip, if you could just go reveal the 2019 data. So 2019 looks a bit smaller than 2018. To put that in context, it's about 13% smaller. But I think looking at the overall picture, the trend is still very positive. So we actually see this as continuing to grow relative to previous years. It's just that 2018 was particularly strong due to things like that EFR tender. So the particular segments in 2019 that struggled were front of meter and CNI. Residential continued to grow, but actually going forward to 2020, we think that much of that growth will return. So we see continued growth in front of meter, partly through increasing numbers of projects, but also partly through a move towards much larger projects, both in the UK, in Germany, and then increasingly further afield. We don't expect the CNI segment to grow enormously in 2020. It's had a challenging year this year, in 2019, and it will be challenging again this year, but we do see growth beyond that. And the residential segment continues to grow, primarily driven by the kind of key markets at the moment. Okay, thanks, Pip. Could you go to the next slide, please? In fact, I should say just briefly before we talk about trends that actually those forecasts were done before the coronavirus pandemic. The impact of this became apparent. We'll talk a bit about the impact of that in the Q&A, I think, at the end if people have questions, but just to let you know that those forecasts were done prior to this outbreak, which will obviously have an impact on the storage markets. But the underlying drivers, the underlying needs for storage will remain, coming out the other side of this troubling time. So the trends in 2019, what's really happening, what's changed since 2018? I think the key thing is probably for the front of meter segment, that ancillary services prices are continuing to fall. So this has been taking place kind of really since 2017 in key storage markets, and it's actually driven by the fact that batteries in particular are so well suited to providing frequency response services. A sign of this is that the EFR tender drove 200 megawatts of storage in the UK, but at prices of around, I think, £7 per megawatt per hour. So that's really low, and that's just indicative of the wider fall in ancillary services prices. So this primarily impacts the front of meter business case, but also has an impact for commercial industrial storage, and actually increasingly for residential storage as virtual power plants become more common. So we see the front of meter value stack shifting more towards merchant models and supporting the electricity system on a wider basis. A second trend was the growth in e-mobility. So stationary storage is really well suited to providing support to electric vehicle charging. Electric vehicle charging is on the rise enormously, and that trend is only expected to continue. But in 2019, it really became apparent that this was driving storage projects, particularly in the commercial industrial segment. It's particularly well positioned to support fast chargers, so where there's a high power requirement, and bus fleets as well. Thanks, Pip. The next trend, I suppose, is worth highlighting is that subsidies are a key driver, particularly for residential storage. So the capex barrier for consumers is obviously quite high. Storage is still relatively expensive, although that trend, there is a trend towards cheaper systems, which is good. But actually, the key residential markets are always those currently driven by subsidies. So Germany has had subsidies, the KfW loans. There have been regional and federal funding as well. Italy's had subsidies in Lombardia and Veneto. There have been subsidies in Switzerland, Austria, places like that. And these are really driving the residential growth. Another trend, which I think Patrick will really talk about, is the clean energy package and the regulatory changes, which are also driving growth and will be a really key driver going forward. Thanks, Pip. Should we go forward and look at the poll? So we thought it would be very interesting to find out what you think, what our listeners think will be the fastest growing market for energy storage in the next 3 years. So we've got the UK and Germany are currently leading the pack, but where do you think will be really interesting in the next three years? So please have a vote, and we'll see what you think.
We'll give you another 10 to 15 seconds to fill out the poll here. I think you can only select one market, and I can see there's many people still choosing. So I'll give you another few seconds before we close that. Great interaction here as well. 80% of you have voted. That's absolutely fantastic. There's a great deal of attendees on the line today, over 200, so it's really great to have so much interaction with you this morning. And that's a minute, so I'm now closing the poll, and we'll share these results.
Okay, well, this is really interesting. This is really interesting to see. I think that you guys are clearly clued in to what's happening, or you've read our report. So actually, I would agree with this assessment. So Italy is definitely showing a lot of growth and a lot of interest, but actually, and Iberia too, and we'll talk about those in fact on the next slide. The Nordics is also very interesting. So I'll just briefly talk through then a few markets and just pull out what's particularly interesting and how they're different from one another and from the kind of the status quo. So yeah, if you could just go to the next one. Thanks, Pip. So this is the front of meter value stack for Italy. Italy is actually the second biggest residential storage market in Europe, and that's great, and that's probably going to continue. It's driven by subsidies, as we said earlier. But what's new actually is Turner's fast reserve grid service, and that's going to drive a lot of front of meter growth. it remains to be seen exactly how the storage industry responds to that, to this pilot, and how accessible it is. And the prices obviously will be very interesting to see, but that's going to drive a lot of growth. So the graph, the chart you can see here is the breakdown of the current installed megawatts by primary application. But actually most of these are almost actually pilots by Turner itself, by the TSO itself. And so we expect to see frequency regulation increase significantly. We also actually expect to see capacity market storage systems increasing, because 200 megawatts of contracts were won by energy storage for delivery in 2023. So this breakdown of storage megawatts by primary application will start to change significantly as these projects come online. And I think it highlights how Italy is really moving fast and becoming very interesting from a front of meter perspective. If we move to Iberia, we're almost at a kind of a step back from Italy. Italy has a big residential segment and will have a big front of meter segment. Iberia has obviously it's been kind of constrained by the sun tax, the self-consumption regulations, which in previous years have prevented the uptake of PV and certainly prevented the uptake of storage. These barriers have been removed in 2019. So actually in both Spain and Portugal, we expect to see the residential segment and the C&I segment improving significantly. Those barriers are now removed. But also the Spanish TSO are kind of perhaps slightly behind the Italian TSO, but catching up, has now opened, or will open the FCR markets to energy storage in 2020. So from the middle of this year, we'll start to see significant interest, I think, in the Spanish market. So Italy has a big residential segment, and front of meter is going to grow significantly. Iberia, particularly Spain, we're going to see growth in the residential segment and the front of meter segment. And actually in Spain, the C&I segment will also be interesting. Finally, Central Eastern Europe. I thought it would be interesting to mention this. There's a lot of interest in Central Eastern Europe. This graph shows the residential systems that we see being installed across the region, but obviously the region is very big, it's disparate, there's a lot of different countries with a lot of different regulatory frameworks. Many of these residential systems were driven by subsidies again, so that's been interesting. I think the thing to say about Central Eastern Europe, I mean, at the moment it's primarily Austria, Switzerland and the Czech Republic, which are the biggest markets, but actually the clean energy package, and we're going to hear more about this from Patrick in a second, will really open up these markets. So at the moment it's fragmented, there's kind of disparate growth across the region, but actually in the next few years we'll really see a lot of growth coming across the board. Thanks, Pip.
Thanks, Robin. And now Patrick is going to talk us through the clean energy package and the implementation and what we've included in our report this year. Thanks, Patrick.
Yes, thank you, Pip. So just to start, I want to maybe continue where we just stopped on the Central and Eastern European situation, because we see that until the clean energy package was published, that in some states, like in the Slovak Republic, it was not possible to install an energy storage device as a standalone. It had to be either behind the meter, or it had to be linked to a power generation unit where you could add it on top of this. So this is one of the points which will have to change in the Slovak Republic because of the clean energy package. And this brings me to the clean energy package, which is actually a package of different legislations which all have an impact on energy and environment, and most of them have therefore a direct impact on energy storage. I will go mainly into the three directives or three texts which are highlighted in blue, which is the Renewable Energy Directive, the Electricity Directive, and also the electricity regulation. Just for information, the difference between a directive and a regulation is that the regulation is directly applicable, meaning that every consumer, every inhabitant, every society, every company in Europe can get rights as soon as a regulation is published. and a directive needs to be transposed into national law. So it's a national government who first needs to transpose it into national law before entities can claim the rights out of such directives. This means, and you will see it on the next slide or the next click, that the countries have now, depending on which text, up to summer next year to transpose all these directives into national law and therefore to make it available. As I said, the regulation is already applicable today. What do we see mainly from this clean energy package? Besides the fact that it is taking energy storage into the system, that for the first time we have a definition of energy storage in the electricity system. What does it mean? It means that energy is stored, it's then used at a later moment, and can be used in another form than electricity. So electricity in, hydrogen out, electricity heat out is an energy storage activity. So this was important to clarify, that it is not only electricity in and electricity out. This has been done. And then there are a lot of other rules which have been put down regarding energy storage, mainly allowing clearly and stating clearly that energy storage may participate in all kinds of services and may not be discriminated against. This was a very important step, and it helped for energy storage to get to the level where it is penetrating more and more the different services which are offered. As said before already, we saw that the services which are remunerated is either behind the counter, so behind the meter, meaning that it is done for specific reasons of shaving the peak of the demand or specific production reasons. But the services which are on the grid are very often driven by specific tenders, and Robin mentioned the EFR and others. And we see that therefore with this new electricity directive and regulation, we see new applications which are emerging. So in EASE for the moment we are updating the potential applications list, and we will push for having these applications also remunerated in different ways. And the clean energy package is very big, but we have taken out some key questions which you see now in front of you. First of all, and I replied to this, is it already implemented? And we see a graph a bit later. No, it is not, but the good news is it has started. The biggest hurdle which is seen for a lot of projects which make them non-economic is that you have to pay or you are taxed twice. So if you charge your device, you're paying a tax on consumption, and if your energy is then finally consumed by the final consumer, you have, or he has, to pay another tax on the consumption. So which makes the legal situation quite unique, because in the laws of physics you can consume a kilowatt hour only once, but the laws of the governments make that it can be taxed twice for consumption. It's a very funny situation. So this is not taken away, but the clean energy package, and it's not taken away because it's the member states who define where they want to put taxes, but the clean energy package clearly states that for grid fees as well as for taxes, there should be no discrimination against energy storage. So it is a soft nudging for governments, but it started already to create a lot of attention in the member states, and more people are discussing, should storage pay double grid fees? And some people say yes, because they use the grid twice. Others claim that it is not necessary because the energy storage devices are supporting the system, and when they support the system, they have a grid-friendly behavior and therefore saving costs on the grid. So both opinions are available, and depending on your point of view, you will adhere to one or the other. Then when we look at the technologies, it was also said by Robin that most of it is electricity storage, electrochemical storage we're looking in this report. But in the clean energy package, there is actually a neutrality regarding technology. It is sometimes coming through that electrochemical is the most used, growing energy storage technology, but it is quite neutral in the document. But what is interesting is the point number 4, because the main revenues which we see now are all, as I said, short-term storage. So we don't see any revenue streams for longer-term storage. But if you want to decarbonize an energy system, this is the aim which we have put down, and we are now discussing to put in on the EU level, that by 2050 you want to be the first carbon neutral continent, legally obliged to be, then we need to balance over seasons. And this is where it's getting tricky, and people are waking up to this, how to make long-term storage economic, how to create a business case for long-term storage. And this will then very likely not be only electrochemical storage, but a lot of other technologies will therefore have to play an important role. Then the next question was about the strategic point of view for storage. And there is a clear yes, there is more and more consideration, because we're going towards a decarbonized society using a lot of electricity from variable energy sources. The targets which we have today in Europe is that by 2030 we will have 32% of renewable energy in the final energy consumption. This means that for electricity we will have 55 to 57% of renewable electricity which will be consumed in Europe. So more than half of all electricity consumed in Europe will come from renewable energy sources in the next decade. This is a huge challenge, and if the cost must stay under control, then there is no other choice than using a lot of flexibility in the system, where energy storage is one important tool, or the most important, I would obviously say, tool to have it. And finally, the point about the funding. Yes, demonstration, deployment, new technologies, it's a lot of funding ongoing. We see that on the level of the EU, we have a European Battery Alliance who's pushing to create battery manufacturing in Europe. We see that there's the Batteries Europe initiative, which is driving and writing research priorities and implementation plans. And we are discussing for the moment the creation of a public-private partnership where a certain amount of money will be ring-fenced, and this will then only be used for batteries research and demonstration. So quite a lot which is pushed by the clean energy package, quite a lot which is going on. And on the next slide, you can see on the implementation from the different parts. So the clean energy package is well advanced in Finland already, but in basically all member states, it is in the moment transposed into national law. And also when you look at the strategic perspective, you see that different member states, if you could just, thank you very much, Pips, you see that a lot of member states has it clearly mentioned in their national energy and climate plans, that they have it strategically addressed, and that they see the role energy storage will have in the future. With this, I hand back to you, Pip.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was really, really interesting. And I'm going to end on local flexibility markets, which I mentioned was our hot topic this year that was included in the report. And before I go into that, we're going to have another poll for those that are still with us. Plenty are still on the line, actually. No one's left yet, which is fantastic. So what do you think? Which value streams do you think will be the most important for behind the meter energy storage in the next 3 years? Is it going to be these DSO flexibility markets? Is it going to remain in the ancillary services with TSOs? Is it going to move to balancing markets, so balancing mechanisms in balance markets? Will it move towards the wholesale markets, so the intraday, day ahead? Or will we see more self-consumption or cost avoidance? So this could be charge avoidance, reducing bills, network charge avoidance, etc., or peak shaving, that sort of thing. So this is a multiple choice. You can click more than one box because, as we know, you really have to stack value streams together for storage. So feel free to tick more than one. And I'm going to give you a few more seconds. We've got about 60–70% of people voted, and it looks like there's quite a clear distinction in where you think the value is going to come from. So another 5 seconds, and I'm going to be closing that poll.
I still believe it's not fair that the organizers and panelists may not vote.
Sorry, Patrick. You can tell everyone your opinion afterwards if you like. Right, that's the end of the that's the end of the poll there. So I'll share these, but Patrick, do feel free to comment and give your opinion too, and Robin as well. So it looks like 69% of the 80% that voted think that self-consumption and cost avoidance is going to be vital for energy storage in the next 3 years, followed by the local markets and then the balancing markets. So less than 20% of you focusing on the ancillary and wholesale markets for energy storage. Patrick, Robin, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say it's similarly. I think the cost avoidance is really one of the drivers. And if you see that in some member states, the electricity, the kilowatt hour is paid 30–35 cents. And if you see that storing your PV electricity is maybe maximum of 10 cents, then it makes sense to have it stored. And the biggest unknown for me is also the DSO flexibility markets, which are emerging. Everybody is starting it, everybody sees the need, but nobody really knows exactly how to implement it for the moment, because there's always a balance between the obligation to keep the frequency, which is the TSO obligation, and the local flexibility. So very interesting.
Yeah, and I'd just add, I think definitely self-consumption cost avoidance being the highest makes absolute sense. It can be, it can make up to 70% of the business case for or even more for behind the meter storage. It comes from those values. I think if we'd done this poll last year, probably TSO services would have won out. So it's really interesting that people are now aware of this fall in value in ancillary services markets and looking at other value streams.
That's great. Thanks, Patrick and Robin, for sharing some extra opinions there. I'm just going to now move on to the next slide, which summarises what Patrick and Robin have just been talking about. So I'll move quickly through this one. But yeah, as we've all been mentioning, most storage projects have been looking at self-consumption, but also the provision of ancillary services, especially for front of meter projects. However, I think we're all in this industry together. We know that this value stack is changing, and in the next few years, we can see this as we're already seeing a general trend across Europe of ancillary service prices deflating as markets saturate. Competition from front of meter primarily, but also behind the meter energy storage is contributing to this. We do expect to see a shift in where the value for storage comes from. I haven't obviously included self-consumption in this chart. This is just more the revenue generation opportunities, but wholesale markets will become more attractive as price volatility in some countries increases. More balancing markets are opening in some markets to distributed assets, and storage is being used by DSOs for constraint management. But obviously stacking these different value streams together is really crucial to the viability of projects. And so let's move to our summary of local flexibility markets in Europe. So in this edition of the Market Monitor, we had our hot topic as DSO flexibility, and we've included some highlights from a major study that we also released separate to this report on exactly this topic. So it was another 80-page report on exactly this topic. But to start, why are DSOs starting to use flexibility and storage? Well, as we all know, distributed generation, electrification of heat and transport, and the emergence of battery storage into the market means that networks are becoming harder to manage. Rather than building bigger networks, we are seeing a trend of European DSOs increasingly considering the use of flexible assets, and this includes storage to help manage their networks. Energy storage can help DSOs and will generate revenue by supporting DSOs to help bridge decision gaps, to solve issues in the medium term while demand falls, and to maximise existing asset lifetime. And the map here shows the current market activity. So the darker colours here show the most active markets where DSOs are moving towards commercial procurement. The very light green here is where it's more paper-based studies, and the medium green colour here is where there are many trials still taking place, but we're not quite on commercial procurement yet. So you can see here clearly that the GB, Great Britain market and the Netherlands have the biggest opportunities for energy storage today, and they are the most active. Commercial procurement is taking place with varying degrees of maturity and success. This is in the GB and Netherlands market, driven by constraint management needs, innovation approaches, and also regulation. So they're the three key driving forces. And the specific services that the DSOs are tendering for in these markets include peak shaving, support during fault conditions, and ensuring compliance. You can also see we have France, Germany, Italy, Spain, Norway, and Sweden. They're at an earlier stage of development. Now, in these markets, DSO activity is largely limited to demonstration projects, with some projects being more advanced than others. So it does vary depending on which market, which project. Now, let's see what assets are being used in these markets then. So it's demand side flexibility broadly, but how does storage fit in to that landscape? At the moment, the main assets being used by DSOs are generators and specifically turn up. However, storage is the second in line. There's a good amount of storage, so larger capacity batteries primarily being used today for these DSO services. And now this is primarily in the two most active markets that we're talking about. A much smaller percentage of flexibility is coming from commercial sites and turned down, and then a very small percentage is from domestic flexibility. So it's clear that storage assets today are key for DSOs, and they are an asset that is being used. But in terms of the value, DSO value today is really a small part of this value stack. It might change in the future, but the markets are just getting started. So there's no sort of boom of FCR equivalent sort of value stream available here. The value streams are still establishing themselves. So moving on, that's the end of the webinar, and we'll move on to our Q&A section now. But before we do that, do you want to hear from us, and would you like more information on any of the things we've been talking about today? So there's a few options. If you're interested in accessing the European Market Monitor on Energy Storage and the 4th edition, so it's the 4th year we've run this, so we're very much the experts in this area now. That is available for purchase as a one-off, either from EMMES or Delta EE. As I said at the start, if you are already a member of either organisation, you will receive this report. If you haven't, get in touch. If you'd like to know more about becoming a member of EMMES and helping with the work they're doing on policy side of things, then tick that box and I'll pass your contact details over to Patrick and his team. And if you'd like to learn more about our own energy storage research service, so Delta EE's Energy Storage Research Service, which is an annual subscription service, please tick that box and I'll get in touch with you later on today. And for anything else, if you just want to chat with Patrick, with Robin, with myself, or find out more about what we're doing, or exchange a view, or just have an informal chat, we're very welcome to that. Please do get in touch. We'd love to hear industry views. So yeah, please tick that box and we'll get in touch. So that's enough of that. Let's move on to our Q&A session. So I'll kickstart the questions by asking firstly Patrick and Robin a summary question, and then I'll move on to your questions in the question poll. Now is the time. If you haven't already, please do send your questions in to the webinar software under questions, and we'll answer them shortly. But let's summarise. So Patrick and Robin, we'll go to Patrick first. If you look back over the last year since the third edition of our report, so the European Market Monitor on Energy Storage 3.0, what's changed with regards to the CEP? Has it developed faster, slower than you thought? Are there any surprises, or are we largely, as we thought about a year ago?
I must say actually that it did turn out and did implement as it was foreseen. So when the political agreement was struck, then it all went downhill from there on. So we're very happy to see that, as we've shown before, so many member states are now implementing it. A lot of member states are using the provisions of the regulation in order to adapt existing services on TSO level or others. And we see that the consumers and the industries also take advantage of this clean energy package and are bidding into different services and are aggregating and come with new ideas on the market. So in a nutshell, it's as planned, very good implemented already, and it's very promising to see how the directive then will be transformed into national.
Thanks, Patrick. And again to Robin, since last year, you also were involved in the reporting last year and have led the reporting this year on our market side for the Delta EE side. What's changed in our forecast since last year? Are we about right? Were we largely off the mark last year? Have there been any surprises that we should tell the audience about?
Yeah, so I think compared with last year, I don't think we really forecast this collapse in the front of meter markets. We did expect them to shrink a little bit, I think, but the scale of the fall was much greater than we expected, and I think that's had a corresponding knock-on effect on our kind of forecast for growth in 2020, which now take into account the change in value stack. So, for example, in Germany this year, I think the number of the megawatts installed has halved in 2019 based on 2018. So it's had a significant effect, and I don't think we captured that. I think the C&I market we were also quite bullish on. We were thinking that the growth would continue, but actually it's proven a much harder kind of nut to crack than we expected. I think this is partly around regulatory uncertainty in the UK and Germany. It's partly around the cost of storage and customers being risk averse, things like that. So I think the thing that surprised me most was probably the fact that the growth this year was smaller than last year.
Great. Thank you, Robin. And I've had a chance to look through the questions. Jeffrey sent us one through on COVID-19, and we did say we'd come back to it at the end. His specific question is, do you think the EU plans subsidies are really sustainable if COVID-19 lasts for more than 3 months? So either to Patrick or Robin for that one.
I mean, the COVID and the impact it has is, as was said by Robin already, it's a bit unclear at the moment, but it will for sure have an impact, mainly I would say behind the meter. And if you look that the grid services are still needed and there's still grid projects will still go through because the grid is changing to more renewable, I think there's no, we will not see a huge impact on the grid related storage.
Thank you, Patrick. Another question we've got. Well, there's so many good ones. This is great. So, Matteo, on your front of meter chart, is the UK capacity market the biggest driver, or the bigger driver? Sorry, that's one for Robin.
No, so actually the capacity market in the UK has not been a strong driver, or has evolved to be a weak driver for storage. Actually, the value that energy storage projects can get from the capacity market because of derating factors, which are really significant, means that it's really, I don't think it's even really worth pursuing for many providers. I think it's yeah, so it's quite telling, I think, that no, I can't remember what I was going to say, but it's I think essentially it's the value is too low. Will be interesting to see what happens in places like Italy with their capacity market, and obviously France has just had their capacity market tenders, and both of those have driven storage, but the derating factors in the UK are not great. It's interesting that actually storage providers in the UK are now, or have in the most recent auctions, have circumvented those derating factors by bidding storage in as demand side flexibility, which is a kind of a loophole that I think the regulators will be looking at closing.
Thanks, Robin. I'm aware we are over time. There is lots of questions. We're going to answer a few more, and we're quite happy as long as you guys are still listening. We're going to still answer your questions. So a few more. There's one from Sidi Ali Sharif on why DSO flexibility market is more active in the UK and the Netherlands. And really, there is a couple of reasons for that. 3 to be precise. The needs in those markets. So there's issues with constraints. So there's higher needs. There's innovation in those markets, and also regulation. So the way in which Ofgem, the regulator in the GB market, and equivalent in Netherlands, are regulating the DSOs and innovation trials. That they're kind of the 3 core reasons there. We have another question from Xavier. What are the trends regarding co-location? The standalone with generation with demand. Lots of questions in one, but all around co-location. Robin?
Yes, so I guess there are 3 ways you could co-locate. You could co-locate with renewable generation, you could co-locate with thermal generation, or you could co-locate with demand, as Xavier asked. Co-locating with renewable generation doesn't, from a front of meter perspective, doesn't really make sense as a business case. Where it does help is in shared connection costs, so using existing capacity, existing grid connections, and saving on capital costs there. But the business case from operating solar, for example, and storage together is not as good as I think people have thought in the past. Regarding thermal generation, there are projects going in co-locating storage with thermal generation. I think Italy has actually had a pilot, the UPI pilot, which was about freeing up thermal capacity from having to provide frequency response in Italy, and allowing and providing that instead for a site using the batteries. But in general, I think you can optimize the efficiency of the thermal plant using storage, but these business cases are relatively limited because those thermal plants will be mothballed eventually, and there's a general trend across Europe for phasing them out. I think the really interesting one is co-locating with demand. So, for example, EV charging was something that I mentioned, and that's going to become an increasing driver for storage as we go forward, as both heat and mobility are electrified. The loads behind the meter will increase, specifically the power consumption will increase, and there will be a need for energy storage to manage grid connections. And I think that's going to be a really big driver, especially for the C&I segment.
Perfect, thank you, Robin. And for Patrick, we've got a few questions on the CEP. One from Robert: why is energy storage not considered a strategic technology in the UK? And we also have a second question, so I'll ask them both together, from Madeline. Do you think the move to maximum day-ahead markets in the CEP is pushing the industry to a more merchant model? How do you think this will affect storage? So I'll hand over to Patrick to answer those questions.
First of all, regarding the strategic perspective, it's just that the member states do decide in their national energy and climate plans, which they had to provide for the European Commission, which activities they push. And storage is seen in the UK, for the moment at least, a lot with system services. And I suppose this is the main reason why, but I can't really tell you why it is not highlighted more importantly. Yeah, but you will see that it will come more and more forward the more we have renewable energy sources. Regarding the obligation to bid for variable renewables into the day-ahead market and therefore to firm the generation, yes, this is definitely pushing to have either hedging with existing generators so that the renewables can draw upon these reservoirs of conventional generators when they cannot provide, or it's looking at storage. But then, as we just heard from Robin, it's very often not economic. But maybe I can add one point to this co-location with thermal plants. What is interesting to see is that a lot of thermal plants, which have the advantage of having big turbines and therefore rotating masses available, are looking into the possibility to replace their boilers with a heat storage. So to use the water steam cycle they have on now, but to store the renewable electricity in form of heat and then use the water in the water steam installation, so driving the turbine, using the cooling tower and generating electricity. And this will be a service which provides, how should I say, it's inertia, natural inertia, locally where it is needed. So for some of these plants, it will make sense, mainly due to the location, to replace the boiler, which may not burn fossil fuels anymore, with a heat storage, also called Carnot battery.
Thanks, Patrick. And a final question now. There's we're running out of time. I don't want to keep everyone online so much, but we've got a few people, Tom, Eugenio, all asking about emerging battery technologies from both the market and technology side and also the policy side. So yeah, which technology will win out? Will it differ by certain uses? Are any particularly pushed in the policy side of things? So, and there's quite a lot of other people as well that have asked around technology. So I think that might be a really good question to end on. Over to Patrick.
Yeah, thank you. So I will take out my crystal ball. Okay. Now, the technologies will move forward from only the conventional lithium-ion batteries. This is something everybody sees. Everybody sees already the evolution of solid-state batteries for safety reasons and others. But then you see that the Commission is pushing quite actively to have new generation or new production of batteries in Europe. And for this purpose, they are looking now in a so-called battery regulation, which is put down to identify some minimum load, the density. They want to have a minimum environmental footprint or a low environmental footprint, a maximum environmental footprint, and they have different other tools to push for more sustainable batteries. As you are aware, the Commission is discussing a lot about the carbon border adjustment. So it used to be a carbon border tax. Now it's not a tax anymore, it's an adjustment, where the Commission wants to make sure that the products entering Europe will have at least the same environmental benefit or the low environmental footprint as products produced in Europe to create a level playing field. So all this will for sure have an impact about the components you may use, about the way you manufacture, about the emissions for the total life cycle of such batteries, and will push for new materials. But which one it will exactly be, I'm sorry, it's a bit foggy in my cloud, in my crystal ball.
I like the crystal ball analogy. Robin, over to you. Have you got a crystal ball? And can you tell the listeners more about which technology in the future will emerge, will win, and will lead?
Yeah, I suppose one thing to say is that there are new announcements about battery technologies and things like that, very regularly. But getting those scaled up to manufacturing and getting them put into applications and used is a very long process, and many of those won't make it. I think it's important to say that actually lithium-ion batteries are doing very well at the moment, and the cost is falling all the time, and they will remain competitive for a long time. We'll start to see longer duration storage, both from extending, actually making lithium sites, assets have a larger energy capacity, but also through new technologies. I mean, flow batteries are one example. I think really you have to compete with lithium, or you have to find somewhere that lithium isn't competing in order to win out at this point. And it's kind of hard to pin down who's going to do that first. I'd say something that is interesting, Patrick mentioned thermal storage. I think the next version of the market monitor that we do will look at thermal storage in more detail, because this is actually the potential for thermal storage for decarbonising industry is enormous, and actually this is going to become quite an interesting part of the storage kind of landscape going forwards.
Thanks, Robin. We're going to, oh, sorry, go on, Patrick.
Can I just add some point? Because if you're looking at new energy storage technologies in EMMES members, you see some startup companies which are making very innovative battery technologies, sometimes even using heat and electricity, so or electrochemical. So it's very interesting. There are some companies like Texel, SaltX, Inolit, or others, Jaser batteries and whatever. So you can go on the webpage and look a bit what they do, and you will find very, very interesting developments for new technologies.
Thank you, Patrick, for adding. I can see that all of you are still online, which is fantastic. Thank you so much for your engagement today. I'm aware of the time we have run over. Obviously, we all love talking about energy storage here, and you guys are all really engaged as well, which is fantastic. We have got a load of questions still to answer, so we're happy to have these over the phone, so we can get in touch with you after the webinar, or feel free to contact us directly. Someone's asked if the slides will be shared. If you would like a copy of the slides, please do get in touch, email myself or Annalie at EMMES, or one of the other speakers today, and we can send you the slides. For a more detailed discussion on the European Market Monitor, we are hosting a webinar for subscribers to Delta EE storage service and to EMMES members who already have access to this report, or for anyone else that buys the report will be able to access that webinar, where we will have much more detailed discussions on this report. But in the meantime, feel free to contact us. We're more than happy to talk about this topic. And thank you very much for attending our webinar today. We look forward to being in contact in the future. And thank you again to Patrick and Robin for your efforts today too.
Thank us to walk us through. Thanks, Robin. Have a nice day.
Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.